So I wonder this morning how many of you are gardeners. Do we have any people keeping gardens out there this spring and summer? Got a few of you there, whether you're doing flower gardens or vegetable gardens. We do a little bit of both. My wife, Elaine, and I. It's not a very big project necessarily. For the last couple of years, we put out tomato plants, 2 or 3 tomato plants out behind our home, and our crop is not all that spectacular, but as far as I'm concerned, keeping any plant alive for any amount of time is a good thing. And we've had some decent tomatoes. And we have one plant in particular that produces the little ones, the cherry tomatoes, which we love. And my wife makes an awesome salad with those little tomatoes and little balls of mozzarella cheese. I wish I could have brought some for all of you. We like gardening and enjoy doing what we can. Now, if you garden, you know that one of the things you're going to deal with if you garden is the presence of weeds. Whatever plant you want to grow in your garden, you're also going to have plants that you don't want to be in your garden. If you make a garden of any kind, when we're planting tomatoes in the springtime, and by we I mean when Elaine is planting tomatoes in the springtime, and I'm cheering her on, we're not thinking about the fact that a few weeks later we're going to have to be there in that garden every day, basically, pulling up weeds and errant grass that grows there. And it's the same in the front of our house. We have an area alongside our porch where we have hosta plants and some flowering plants and some ferns that come up volunteer every year, and those get invaded by weeds all the time. So one morning, not so long ago, I went out to the front, our front porch area, reluctantly, knowing I was going to have to pull up a lot of grass and weeds and stuff amongst our plants out there. And I looked down at one of our ferns, and we have some really pretty ferns that grow up in front of our house. And alongside that fern, I happened to see a plant that is the scourge of gardens and yards everywhere, at least the yards and gardens that I've had. And I had battled it at length in the place that Elaine and I used to live in before we moved to this area. It's known by many names. I learned it as ground ivy. Ground ivy. And it's a plant that can just spread like a disease in any yard or garden. Ground ivy has a really strong, deep, intricate root system, just an entangling root system. And it's also got waxy leaves that are kind of covered with a waxy film that resist any kind of weed spray or anything that would kill it. About the only way you can deal with ground ivy is just to get in alongside the plant and get down alongside the root and just pull the whole thing up, and you got to get it root and all or it will come back. So I see this ground ivy growing right next to our best little fern out front. So I figured I'm an expert in this. I know how to take care of this. So I got down on my knees and I got to digging around the roots of that ground ivy, got as far down that root as I could possibly get, got a grip on it and yanked it up and took the fern right with it. And quickly separated them and hoped Elaine wasn't looking and got the roots back down to the fern, back down there, and hoped she wouldn't notice. Turned brown in 2 days. Thinks she noticed. So, now this reminded me of something. If you garden and you have plants that you want to grow and thrive, here's the deal, there will be weeds. There just will be weeds. No matter how much you try to prevent it, and no matter how much you try to eradicate it, you're going to have weeds that you're going to have to deal with. And you have to be careful that as you go after the weeds, you don't damage or destroy the good plants as well. Now, in guests especially, this is not a gardening class. This is not what we do at St. Paul's. This is my feeble way of getting us into one of Jesus' parables. For the next several weeks, some of the leaders of the church are going to each be sharing with every worship service their favorite parable. As I said, Pastor Aaron, our lead pastor, is doing that right now in the Epic Center. And parables, just so you know, are communication tools that Jesus used that use very common images, very well-known stories, very common individuals to talk about an uncommon thing, the inbreaking of the very kingdom of God into human history. Jesus used ordinary stuff to talk about something extraordinary, things we see all the time to look at and all of a sudden have our thinking pushed and expanded, and in fact, with the goal from Jesus' standpoint of getting our world turned upside down so we might see the world as He sees it. And today's parable is about plants and weeds. Now, you never know when God's going to try to capture your attention or to get through to you somehow, so we encourage note-taking here at St. Paul's. If a phrase, a word, something from the Bible, something from a song, a question that you might have really gets inside your mind and will not go away, write that down or enter that on your electronic device or remember that, because God might be getting you ready for something or might be getting you ready for a conversation with somebody else. And after today, continue your own examination of Jesus' parables, not just this one, but the others that will be coming up. Use the study guide. That's the next tear-off section in your program. That's a short version of it. Or you can go online at our website, sp.church, and you can find a more extensive, deeper version of the study guide. So Jesus communicated and still communicates in a variety of powerful ways. One of His most powerful ways was through parables. And as I said earlier, He just uses common things as a way to help us experience something uncommon, the kingdom of God. For example, in one parable, Jesus used the image of planting seeds. Everybody would know at that time when He first said it what that was about. In one parable, He talks about land that has some kind of a treasure on it. In another parable, He talks about a merchant trying to buy a pearl that is very, very valuable. He talks about fishermen. He talks about masters and servants. He talks about fathers and wayward sons. He talks about sheep and lost coins and all kinds of things. Very ordinary things. They were visual pictures very familiar with the first persons who heard these parables from the lips of Jesus. And they're used to point to something bigger and beyond human description. So here is today's parable about a grain crop and about weeds. Listen to this. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in the field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you're pulling up the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." Now, you need to know that wheat that was grown in the Middle East, where Jesus was, is very much like wheat here in North America. And it's a crop there that is planted usually after early rains in November and December in their seasons, and then harvested anywhere from April to June. Now, in the Middle East, today and in the first century as well, bread is a basic staple of their diet. Bread in so many different ways, and bread basically at every single meal. So the need for wheat flour was and is very, very high in the Middle East. In addition, and this is kind of interesting, wheat was a snack food as well. They would actually roast the grains of wheat and just eat them directly, just as a snack. So in many ways, wheat was symbolic, and still is, of life itself in the Middle East. Very important plant. Now, the weed to which Jesus is referring in this parable is known as zizania. Other people know it as bearded darnel. And when this particular plant tassels, as you can see, it has a very similar look to wheat. Very similar. To the untrained eye, it's hard to tell the difference. The owner and the servant, as Jesus described them, they'd have to be very experienced farmers to know the difference between the two. Now, zizania, or bearded darnel, also has a very deep, intricate root system, just like the ground ivy I was talking about earlier. So it's highly likely that if you go to pull up bearded darnel, you might endanger the roots of a healthy plant that might be nearby. Now, in this, maybe Jesus was trying to say that the landowner was more experienced than the servants. The servants might have been rookies and not able to tell the difference. We really don't know. In any case, Jesus wants us to hear this parable and know that we're dealing with a weed that is hard to eradicate and possibly dangerous to the plants around it. That's important to realize. So let's look at the basic flow of this parable. The landowner has a goal, a good crop of wheat. An enemy, someone has gotten in and planted a false wheat amongst his crop. Servants of the landowner want to help the landowner with the goal, the good crop of wheat. So they say, do you want us to go in and pull the weeds up, to pull up the bad plant and get it out of there? But the owner tells them, don't do it. Don't focus on the weeds. Just let the two crops grow together. He doesn't want any damage done to the wheat while it's growing. He says, wait till the harvest, at which time the two will be separated. So why does Jesus want us to hear this parable? Well, here's the thing about parables. You need to know this for the next several weeks. You can never plumb the depths of a parable. You will never be able to say, oh, I got that, I understand it fully. That's the nature of parables. But I think one reason Jesus wants us to hear this parable is this. Sometimes, in seeking something good, we focus only on getting rid of the bad and do damage to the good. That's a little convoluted. Let me repeat that. Sometimes, in seeking something good, we focus only on getting rid of the bad and end up doing damage to the good. For example, with the ferns in front of our house, the goal was to have nice-looking ferns out there. That's the good. To accomplish that, I got all focused on getting rid of something bad, tearing up the ground ivy. In the course of that, I did damage to the good thing. The landowner in the parable wants something good, a healthy wheat crop. But he doesn't want the weeds taken up, the focus on something bad, getting rid of something bad, because it might do damage to the good crop. Another way to say this is this. If you focus on something negative to accomplish something positive, you may end up with something negative. Now, let me try to convey this coming away from the plants and weeds image and into an image that may be more common to a lot of us today. Let's talk about the world of baseball, subject near and dear to my heart. And I promise I will not bring up the series last weekend in Kansas City between the Cardinals and the Royals, much as I'd like to. In the history of baseball, thousands and thousands of players have tried but not made it to the major leagues, or got to the major leagues and just didn't stay there very long, weren't very successful. Some baseball theorists say that's because when a player gets to that level, they become so focused on eliminating all the negative things from their game that they forget to focus on the positive thing, that is, being the best player they can be and contributing to their team's success. For example, one of the negative things about baseball that no player wants in their statistics is strikeouts. Being called out on strikes or going down swinging, that's just not what a ball player wants to tally up on his record. And so, when a player hits the major leagues, coming out of the minor leagues, what they say is they can come up to bat and their desire to eliminate the weed of a high strikeout total in their stats becomes so strong that they become hesitant to swing, to commit themselves. Put the ball in play less, and their batting average goes down. Because they're focused on something, getting rid of something negative, over focusing on accomplishing something positive. Let me introduce you to the man who a century ago in baseball was known as the strikeout king of the American League. That is George Herman Ruth. He was known as the Babe. He played many, many years for the Yankees. For 5 seasons, Babe Ruth led the American League in total strikeouts for the season, more than any other batter. There's not a ball player alive who would like to have that statistic on his record. But those of you who are baseball aficionados and historians don't know Babe Ruth by those 5 strikeout titles. You know the fact that on September 30th, 1927, Babe Ruth hit his 60th home run of the season, establishing a single-season home run record that would stand for the next 3.5 decades. How did he do that? He didn't care how often he struck out. He didn't try to eradicate that weed from his statistics. He swung freely, and Babe Ruth would be up to bat 4 times in a ball game. He could strike out 3 of those times, but that 4th time, he'd hit one over the fence with base runners on, and that would win the game for the Yankees. Because he chose to focus his energy on the goal, the positive, and not just all his time eliminating the weeds in his game. I see so often this tendency to pour your energy into getting rid of the negative in people, in organizations, in movements, in churches. I think it's in play right now in our national politics. I think most Americans, no matter which side of the political divide they stand on, want this nation to be the best it can be as the land of the free and the home of the brave, a place with liberty and justice for all. We function with a 2-party system. The parties at their best provide a check and balance on one another, each seeking the common goal. But for whatever reason right now in our history, because there are cyber attacks encouraging us this way, or whether we're doing it to ourselves, I don't know. But we have become so divided that each side of the spectrum believes that the best way to be the best America we can be is to eradicate the weed that is the other side. If you oppose the present administration, your tendency is to assume if we can just get that weed gone, everybody that supports that weed gone, then America will be fine. If you support the present administration, you assume that if we could just get rid of the weeds of all who oppose it, then America would be fine. And I ask you, how is any of this making us better as the land of the free and the home of the brave? Focusing on getting rid of the weeds, seeing our opponents as weeds to be eliminated. And I'm going to stop talking about this subject now. We're going to have a whole nother sermon. Let's go to the ministry of a church. The ministry of any church can become so focused on just eliminating the negative or so focused on pulling up the weeds that we end up doing damage to the positive we want to accomplish in making disciples for Jesus Christ. I remember one of the churches that I was sent to as a new pastor earlier in my career. My wife Elaine and I drove to this community to see the church building where I'd be doing ministry. And when we pulled up to the building, the first thing we noticed, the very first thing that caught our attention was not the building itself. It was not how nice the grounds around the building were or were not. It was not the parking lot or the neighborhood or any of that. The very first thing we noticed when we pulled up to this building was the most prominent, most frequently word used on signs all around the building. Big, tall, red, 6-inch and thick letters on multiple signs at the doorway and in the parking lot. And the word that you saw as soon as you pulled up to the building was the word no. No. And the word right under no on all those signs was skateboarding. No skateboarding. This church had decided that in whatever it wanted to accomplish as a church, the most important thing it could do, signage outside the building, was to eliminate the weed of skateboarders. Now I ask you, who wants to go to a church where the most prominent word you see outside the building is the word no? I didn't want to go, and I was the new pastor. Now, I'm going to sidebar and tell you a really cool story I heard after the first service. One of our friends here in church came up and talked about her son's church in California that had the same phenomenon of skateboarders using the parking lot and the sidewalks and all that kind of stuff. And instead of saying no to those skateboarders, they decided, well, maybe this isn't a weed after all. Maybe this is a ministry that God wants us to do. And they now bring people to Jesus Christ by the dozens because they come to skateboard on the church's property. Do you see the difference? The church that I was assigned to did irreparable damage to its ability to bring people into the arms of Jesus because it focused on getting rid of the negative instead of the positive. Not too many years ago, Christian researchers David Kinnaman and Gabe Lyons did an extensive study of people in our nation who are not committed to Jesus Christ and not affiliated with any church anywhere. They wanted to know, what do unreached people really think about church people? And they published their somewhat disturbing results in a book printed several years ago called Unchristian. And among the top impressions unreached people had of church people, here is the one that was to me the most disturbing. Unreached people know more about what church people are against than what we are for. They know more about what we're against than what we're for. Maybe by no intent on our part, but unreached people know that church people are against this way of dress, or against this type of music, or against this particular lifestyle, or against this style of worship, or against this government policy, or against this, or against that. And any of those things that we're against, maybe things we ought to be against, but that's not the point. The point is that they know us by pouring all of our energy into pulling weeds. And because that's how they know us, it means that they don't know what we're for. They don't know that we are for people experiencing the pursuing, furious love of a God who's willing to become one of us and die and rise for us. That's the good crop Jesus is talking about in this parable of the landowner and his wheat. Unreached people see us as fighting weeds all the time. And here's what Kinnaman and Lyons says happens because of that. They look at us and they know us by what we're against, the weeds that we're pulling, and they say, man, they spend a lot of time going after negative. I got enough negative battles in my life. I don't want to be a part of that. And you see what happens? It becomes a wall, a barrier that keeps people from coming to an active faith in Jesus Christ. All because too many Jesus followers expend all their focus and all their energy on pulling weeds. Now let me say real quickly, weeds are real, and weeds can be dangerous, whether they're literal weeds in a garden or the figurative weeds that a person faces in their life as a follower of Jesus or that a church has to deal with. But primary focus on weeds alone can get us all tangled up, just like the tangling of the roots of the wheat and the bearded darnel or the roots of the ground ivy and the fern. In the first church I ever served as a pastor, we had a great family that was a part of that church that came to us. It was a single mom and her 5 kids, and they came to us because in those days there were churches, maybe there are now, I don't know, there were churches that if you went through a divorce, even if you did not seek the divorce, you were still banned, you were still shunned from that church. So they came to our church. She was a great lady. She was deeply committed to Christ. She wanted to be the best mom she possibly could be. She wanted to provide her kids with an environment in which they could experience what it meant to live a Christian life. But she became convinced that there was one thing going on in the early 80s that was going to pull her kids to the dark side if we didn't get rid of it. It was a weed that if we didn't pull it up, it was going to poison her children and all teenagers everywhere. It was going to bring an end to Christianity as we know it. And it was this. How many of you remember these guys? as Kiss. And they were pretty edgy for the time. Yeah, they had a lot of parents pretty worried. But this beloved woman took it as her mission to want to pour all of our energy into eliminating the sale of their albums and promoting, getting Kiss away from kids and all kinds of rock bands like that. And here's the thing, though, what happened? Because she poured all her focus into that, pulling up that weed, she'll tell you today, she neglected her own relationship with Jesus. And because she did that, she pushed her children for a time farther away from Christ. God's a great God, and kids have since come back. 2 of them are involved in church vocational ministry now. But at that time, with the best of intentions, she poured all her energy into pulling weeds, into something negative. And she almost did damage to the crop. I have to ask now, how many of you were Kiss fans as kids? And look where you are. You survived it. I'm just saying, okay? So what do we do? Because life can get really, really weedy, and the world is weedy, and churches become weedy, and even our own faith can be overgrown with weeds. Well, here are some steps we can take. First, accept that there will be weeds. We just live in a fallen world. We do, and Satan is at work. There are no perfect people. There are no perfect governments. There are no perfect neighborhoods. There are no perfect churches. Life is weedy. Families are weedy. I'm weedy. Y'all weedy. Weeds are there. They just happen. Second, don't be more focused on weeds than the crop. This doesn't mean you ignore the weeds. It doesn't mean you don't deal with them when you have to. It just means your primary focus needs to stay on Jesus and that which is the desire of Jesus' heart, seeking and embracing the last, the lost, and the least, and the lonely. For those of you in a relationship with Jesus, don't just focus on what you want to eliminate from your life, the weeds you want to get out of your life to be a Jesus follower. Focus on what you want more of Jesus in my heart, more of God's heart for those who God loves. Third, don't quit because of the weeds. That's what I think that may be what the parable really is all about. You see the weeds, well, what's the use? Quit. See people do that all the time in their faith, in their life. One of the manifestations of this tendency is what I'll call church hopping. People don't find the perfect church. They just keep moving until they find the one that's perfect. I don't like this church. It's got a bunch of flawed people in it. I don't like this church. It doesn't believe exactly what I believe. I don't like this church because it doesn't do the things that make me feel comfortable all the time. So I'm going to go keep finding another church. If weeds are nearby, you concentrate on being the best possible crop you can be. Finally, trust that God will sort it out. And that may be what the parable is really all about. Here's the thing, folks. The weeds don't win. Spoiler alert. Jesus wins. And the parable makes this clear. Ultimately, we're not the judges and we shouldn't be the weed pullers. Our job is to make sure the crop thrives. So I guess the question is, for all of us, how much weed pulling are you doing right now? And how much is your focus there and not on the positive to which God's calling you? Do you feel like you're in the weeds right now? Are you more focused on the weeds than the good crop? If you're somebody who wouldn't identify yourself as a Jesus follower, what's your view of those who are? Do you know Christians more by what we're against than what we're for? Have Christians made you feel like a weed? What would it be like if it's true that Jesus is for you, really for you, and not out to just pull you up by the roots and cast you aside? And if you are a Jesus follower, what does that mean to you? Is your Christian faith more about getting rid of bad weeds all the time? Or more about cultivating the good crop? I'm just going to tell you the truth. St. Paul's is a weedy church. If you're here and you're hoping this is the perfect one, sorry, better keep moving, because this isn't it. This isn't it. We're not perfect. Where weediness needs to be addressed, we address it. But more than anything, we are a church that puts our primary focus on a great harvest for Jesus Christ. And I want to tell you that in these uncertain, turbulent times, and in the unknown and uncertainty that is ahead of us, this is exactly the crop I want to be a part of, weeds and all. So that's what I think. What do you think? Think about that as we pray.